What if Mercy arrived wearing an American uniform? The German prisoners had braced themselves for hatred, for the cold stare of revenge. But when the truck stopped and the gates opened, they saw sunshine, fields of gold, and men with easy smiles. Karl Weber stepped down first, 27, thin and pale, the scent of diesel still clinging to his clothes. He saw a table, metal bowls lined up, a tub of melting ice cream, bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in the heat. For a moment, no one moved. The war had taught them not to trust anything that looked kind. But then Sergeant Frank Miller, 34, spoke, his voice firm but calm. "Welcome to America, gentlemen. You'll be treated fair here." The words hung in the air like something foreign. Karl's hands trembled as he took the bottle, cold glass biting his palm. He looked at Lieutenant Rose Carter, 29, who stood watching with quiet conflict, her nurse's uniform white against the dusty air. It wasn't sweetness he tasted first. It was disbelief. Could justice really look like this? That night, the barracks hummed with whispers. The POWs lay on clean mattresses, their boots lined neatly by the door, a courtesy unexpected. Karl Weber stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the wood as Hermann Kruger mumbled prayers in the corner. Outside, the American guards shared jokes by the fire, their laughter distant but real. Karl thought of his mother, of the cold camps in Europe, of a world that had forgotten how to be kind. He wondered if this, too, was part of the war, to confuse the enemy with compassion. Yet when Sergeant Frank Miller passed by with blankets, his expression didn't speak of strategy. It spoke of simple decency, and that, Karl realized, was more disarming than any weapon. At dawn, Rose Carter walked through the compound, her white uniform glowing against the blue morning haze. The prisoners stood in line, silent and wary. She handed Karl a bandage for his blistered hands, her touch gentle but brief. "You were an artist," she said quietly, noticing the sketch in his pocket, a charcoal drawing of the camp. Karl nodded, uncertain if he should answer. Around them, birds sang as if they didn't know about borders. Rose looked at him again and said, "You can't erase what you've seen, but maybe you can draw something new, for the first time." Karl smiled. Later that day, Sergeant Miller watched the men work in the fields. They tilled the soil, planted vegetables, and built fences with quiet discipline. Hermann Kruger barked orders in German, trying to keep order among men who no longer knew what to believe in. When one young POW fainted under the heat, Jimmy Hall ran to help without hesitation. The gesture shocked Hermann. This enemy boy helping one of his own. Miller noticed and said, "War's over, friend. Out here, we just get the work done." Hermann looked away, his pride cracking, though he would never admit it. Evening settled gently over the camp. The POs sat quietly, eating from tin plates as the sun melted into the horizon. Karl sketched by the fence, drawing the American guards, the fields and the sky, everything that felt unreal. Rose approached, holding 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. "You never had this before, did you?" she asked. Karl shook his head, smiling faintly. "No," he said, "and I never thought it would taste like forgiveness." Rose didn't reply, but her eyes softened. Somewhere beyond the fields, a radio played swing music, and for one fragile moment, the war seemed to end for both of them. Morning light streamed through the barracks windows, painting long stripes across the wooden floor. Karl Weber, 27, sat sketching on a scrap of brown paper, his pencil soft against the grain. Sergeant Frank Miller, 34th, walked in, curious. "You draw better than most men talk," he said with a faint smile. Karl looked up, unsure if it was a compliment or a test. "It helps me forget," he answered softly. Miller studied him for a moment before replying, "Don't forget. Just learn to live with it." The air hung heavy with unspoken truths. Soldiers from opposite sides, bound now by something greater than orders. Guilt. Outside, the camp's flag fluttered, its rhythm steady and forgiving. The days turned gentle. The POWs were assigned to a nearby farm to help with the harvest. Rows of corn stretched endlessly, gold against the blue sky. Private Jimmy Hall, 22, laughed easily, tossing a cob toward Carl Weber, who caught it awkwardly before smiling. Herman Kruger, 41, watched in silence, his pride wounded but his spirit softening. "Strange, isn't it?" he muttered to himself. "We came here as prisoners, but they treat us like workers." The American farmer nodded approvingly from his porch, his old dog resting beside him. For a brief moment, the war felt far away, replaced by something simpler: sweat, sun, and the small rhythm of shared labor. That evening, as the sun lowered, Rose Carter, 29, walked toward the field with a first aid kit. She found Carl sitting alone by the fence, sketching again. This time, not barbed wire or soldiers, but the open sky. "You draw hope," she said gently, sitting beside him. Carl nodded. "It's easier than drawing what I've done." Rose looked at him, her eyes heavy with understanding. "You're not the only one haunted," she whispered. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of forgiveness trying to find its shape. Night fell, and laughter drifted from the American campfire. Carl listened from afar as Jimmy Hall's voice carried through the air. "You guys ever tried baseball?" he shouted toward the POW barracks. Silence followed. Then a hesitant 9. Miller laughed. "Tomorrow, then." Herman shook his head, muttering, "Games. They want to make us forget we're prisoners." But Carl didn't see manipulation. He saw something human. The war had divided them by uniform, yet here they were, men trying to remember how to live. The stars above blinked cold and eternal, but the firelight below spoke of warmth, forgiveness, and strange beginnings. The next day, the baseball game began. The field was uneven, the bases made from folded jackets. American soldiers on one side, German prisoners on the other. A scene no one could have imagined months ago. Rose Carter stood nearby, laughing as Jimmy Hall struck out dramatically. Carl stepped up to bat, gripping wooden stick with nervous hands. "Don't hold back!" Miller called out. The pitch came fast, and Carl swung. The crack echoed, sending the ball high into the blue. For a heartbeat, everyone forgot who was who. Just men, cheering under the same sun. As Carl rounded the base, Herman Kruger, once proud and bitter, smiled for the first time. The laughter faded with the season's change. Autumn crept in quietly, carrying with it the chill of memory. Carl Weber, 27, sat by the fence, sketching fallen leaves when a convoy of new prisoners arrived. Broken, hollow men from another camp in the east. Their eyes told stories too heavy to speak. Hermann Kruger, 41, stiffened as he saw them. Men he recognized, survivors of his own unit. The air turned thick. Sergeant Frank Miller, 34th, noticed the tension and approached slowly. "You know them?" he asked. Hermann didn't answer. His silence was louder than any confession. Carl felt something inside him shift, as if the truth had finally stepped through the gate, uninvited. That night, the barracks were filled with whispers again. But not of mercy this time, of guilt. The new arrivals spoke of burned villages, of orders followed and ignored. Carl sat frozen, listening. Kruger gave the command. One man muttered. The words dropped like stones in still water. Carl looked toward Hermann, who sat in the shadows, unmoving. The man who had scolded them for weakness now seemed small, fragile, human. When the lights dimmed, Carl couldn't sleep. He thought of Rose Carter's words, "You can draw hope," and wondered if justice could exist beside forgiveness, or if one always erased the other. The next morning, Carl approached Sergeant Miller. "I need to tell you something," he began quietly. Miller looked up from his papers. "About Kruger." Carl nodded. The American's expression didn't harden. Instead, it softened with understanding. "You're not his judge," Miller said, "but Truth doesn't stay buried forever. Outside, Rose Carter watched the exchange through the window, sensing the shift in the air. For the first time, Carl felt torn between duty and decency. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted peace. Yet peace, he realized, sometimes demands the courage to speak. When confronted, Herman Kruger didn't deny it. He stood still, eyes fixed on the ground. "We were soldiers," he said. "We followed orders." His voice cracked, stripped of pride. Miller listened without anger. "Only weariness. War doesn't erase what's right," he replied. Rose entered quietly, her presence soft but firm. "Justice isn't vengeance," she said. "It's truth with compassion." Herman's eyes filled, the weight of his choices crushing him more than any cell could. Carl turned away, unable to watch. In that moment, none of them were victors, only witnesses to how humanity bends but doesn't quite break. Days passed in silence. Herman no longer barked orders or spoke of honor. He worked quietly in the fields beside Carl, who now saw not an enemy, but a man lost in his own memories. One afternoon, as they loaded crates together, Herman whispered, "I'm sorry." Carl didn't answer right away. He looked at the man who once terrified him, now frail and hollow under the gentle sun. "I know," Carl said finally. "That's enough." The wind rustled through the corn, carrying away words that didn't need to be heard by anyone else. Somewhere nearby, Rose Carter watched, her eyes glistening, knowing that this, too, was justice. Winter arrived with gray skies and biting wind, and the camp changed with it. The laughter that once echoed across the yard was gone, replaced by the creak of frozen gates and the hush of snow. Carl Weber, 27th, now worked in the supply shed, his sketches tucked away under his cut. One morning, Sergeant Frank Miller, 34th, received an order. The War Crimes Division wanted Herman Kruger transferred east for questioning. Carl overheard his chest tightening. He had spoken the truth, and now it carried weight. When Miller caught his eye, he didn't speak. He only nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the burden justice demanded. That night, Carl sat awake, the sound of the wind against the walls louder than his thoughts. Rose Carter, 29, entered softly, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. "They're moving him tomorrow," she said. Carl nodded, his eyes distant. "I didn't want this," he whispered. Rose sat beside him, her voice steady but gentle. "Justice isn't always about wanting. Sometimes it's about letting truth breathe." The lantern between them flickered, its flame bending with every gust. For a moment, the room felt like the only warm place left in the world. Morning came pale and bitter. 2 U.S. military trucks rolled into the yard, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Herman Kruger, 41, stood in chains beside Sergeant Miller. "You did what you had to," Miller said to Carl, who watched from the steps. Herman's eyes met his. No anger, no blame, only weary acceptance. "You spoke truth," he murmured in German. "That's more courage than I ever had." As the truck door closed, Carl turned away, the sound of the engine echoing long after it was gone. Justice had been done, yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss. Days later, the camp felt emptier. The men worked quietly, each lost in thought. Jimmy Hall, 22, tried to lift spirits with jokes, but even he couldn't ignore the weight that lingered. One afternoon, he joined Carl by the fence, offering him a cigarette. "Never figured I'd feel bad for a man like Kruger," Jimmy said. Carl took a slow breath. Maybe that's what peace is. Feeling sorry for those who never found it. The wind moved through the barren trees, whispering like ghosts of the past. Jimmy didn't reply. He simply nodded, the smoke curling between them like fragile truce. A week after Herman's departure, Rose found Carl painting on a piece of old canvas, a field, a flag, and a man standing alone in the snow. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. "A man I once hated," Carl said. She smiled faintly. Then you've learned what justice really means. He looked at her, the brush trembling in his fingers. It means losing something, he murmured. Rose shook her head. No, it means finding something worth keeping. Outside, the sky began to clear, and for the first time in months, sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling warmth into the cold barracks. Winter loosened its grip, and with it came a strange quietness, not of loss, but of peace, returning in small breaths. The snow melted into streams that ran along the fences, carrying away the cold memories of war. Carl Weber, 27th, stepped outside one morning to find the first buds of spring pushing through the mud. Sergeant Frank Miller, 34th, joined him, coat unbuttoned, hands deep in his pockets. You'll be going home soon, he said. Carl looked across the field. Home, he repeated softly, as if the word no longer had a shape. Miller clapped him on the shoulder. You'll find it again. Just don't forget what you learned here. The breeze carried warmth and something like forgiveness between them. The camp prepared for release. Trucks were repaired, papers stamped, and farewells whispered between men who had once been enemies. Rose Carter, 29, stood by the infirmary window, watching Carl carry his few belongings: a rolled canvas, a tin cup, a small sketchbook. You'll leave behind the worst of yourself, she said as he approached. Carl smiled faintly. And maybe find what's left of the best. She reached out, pressing a folded note into his palm. Something to remember that not all borders are drawn in ink. He didn't open it, but the gesture felt heavier than words. The final roll call echoed across the field. Men lined up, their faces tired but free. Jimmy Hall, 22, moved between them, shaking hands, laughing softly, though his eyes were damp. Didn't think I'd miss you fellas, he said, his grin hiding the ache. Carl clasped his hand. Maybe one day you'll visit Germany, he said. Only if you teach me to draw, Jimmy replied. Their laughter rose against the wind, light and unburdened, the sound of something new being born from everything broken. The guards lowered the American flag halfway, not for defeat, but for remembrance. As the trucks rumbled out of the camp, Carl looked back one last time. The barracks, the fence, the fields, all pieces of a strange peace he hadn't known could exist. Rose stood near the gate, her white uniform glowing in the sun. She lifted her hand in a quiet farewell. Carl pressed his palm against the window, the glass cool beneath his skin. He didn't wave back, but his eyes said everything words couldn't. In that silent moment, forgiveness felt real, like spring itself, unstoppable, gentle, and alive. By the time the convoy reached the harbor, the world had already started over. The air smelled of salt and possibility. Carl stood on the dock, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. He opened Rose's note at last. Inside was a simple line written in delicate handwriting. Justice begins where hate ends. He smiled, tucking it into his jacket. As the ship horn sounded, he looked back once more toward the distant shore. America fading into mist, yet leaving behind a light inside him that would never go out. Germany looked nothing like the land Carl Weber, 27th, remembered. The cities lay in ruins. Walls crumbled, windows shattered, the air still heavy with the smoke of yesterday's fire. He stepped off the train carrying only a small satchel, a sketchbook, and the folded note from Rose Carter. The people who passed him had hollow eyes, their footsteps slow and uncertain. Carl walked through streets that smelled of ash and bread, seeing children play beside wreckage. For the first time, he understood that coming home wasn't the end of war. It was the beginning of healing. He whispered softly to himself, "Justice begins where hate ends." And for the first time in years, the words felt like truth. Carl found his mother living in a small cottage outside Dresden, its roof patched with old wood and cloth. She was older now, her hair silvered, and her eyes tired but bright. When she opened the door, silence filled the air, disbelief, then tears. She held him tightly, her hands trembling as if afraid he might vanish. "You came back," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would." Carl smiled faintly, pressing his forehead to hers. "Neither did I." The walls of that small home held no riches, only the warmth of survival, and in that embrace, the war truly ended for both of them. Weeks passed, and Carl began painting again. Not soldiers, not ruins, but life. Children playing, farmers planting, the sky wide and forgiving. His neighbors, once suspicious of his silence, began stopping by to watch him paint, asking questions about America. "They gave you food?" one man asked, puzzled. "Ice cream," Carl replied with a small smile. They laughed, but he could see the disbelief in their faces. To them, kindness from the enemy was a foreign story. Yet as Carl shared more, the laughter softened, turning into something warmer. Hope, maybe, or understanding. One evening, Carl walked to the town square where a group of veterans argued loudly about justice and betrayal. One man slammed his fist on a table, shouting, "They showed us no mercy. Why should we forgive?" Carl stepped forward quietly, voice steady. "Because if we don't, we never stop fighting." The crowd fell silent. His words didn't win applause, but they stayed in the air, hanging between bitterness and hope. As he walked away, he glanced back and saw one man lower his head. It wasn't victory. It was a beginning. That night, alone in his small cottage, Carl opened his sketchbook one last time. On one page, he drew the camp, the fence, the fields, the table with melting ice cream and Coca-Cola bottles. On the next, he drew Rose Carter, 29, smiling beneath the American sky. He folded the sketch carefully, placed it beside Rose's note, and closed the book. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing. Carl looked out the window, the rhythm of the rain matching his heart. The world, broken as it was, still held beauty, and that he knew was justice enough. Spring bloomed fully that year. The hills of Dresden shimmered with wildflowers, and the air smelled of rain and rebirth. Carl Weber, 27th, worked quietly in his small garden when the village postman arrived, waving a letter with a foreign seal. Carl froze. It was from America. He opened it slowly, the paper thin and careful as if it knew it carried something fragile. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Rose Carter's. The camp closed last month. I've left the service. I wanted you to know that mercy still matters, even when no one's watching." Carl smiled softly, reading every line twice. The world had moved on, but her words carried the same calm strength that once made an enemy believe in goodness again. Carl spent the evening writing his reply. His words came slowly, each one chosen like a brushstroke on a fragile canvas. "You were right, Rose," he wrote. "Justice begins where hate ends. I've seen it here too. In laughter, in rebuilding, in children who no longer look at the sky with fear." He paused, looking toward the fading horizon. "You once gave me a bottle of Coca-Cola. It tasted strange then, like confusion. Now I think it tasted like forgiveness." He sealed the envelope and placed it on the table, candlelight flickering beside it. A small symbol that sometimes the world heals one letter at a time. Weeks later, a group of local school children came to see Carl's paintings. He showed them his favorite one, the camp yard with soldiers and prisoners sitting together, sharing ice cream and Coca-Cola under a bright American sky. "Who are they?" one child asked. Carl smiled. "Men who forgot they were enemies." The children laughed, but their laughter was different, light, unscarred. As they left, Carl looked at the painting again. It wasn't about the war anymore. It was about the moment mercy won. Years passed, and Carl's story quietly became part of the village. A man who painted peace where there had once been pain. One rainy afternoon, he received a parcel from America. Inside was a small photograph. Rose Carter, now older, standing beside a new hospital with a plaque beneath it that read, "Mercy heals all wounds." Carl placed the photo on his shelf beside his sketches. The world had changed, but the same light from that day in the camp still burned somewhere deep inside both of them. On his last evening, Carl sat beneath the blooming apple tree outside his cottage, the same sketchbook on his lap. He opened it to the first page. The camp, the men, the Coke bottles, the strange taste of justice and kindness. He smiled, closing it gently. The wind moved through the blossoms, carrying petals through the open window, scattering them across the note that still read, "Justice begins where hate ends." The world around him shimmered with peace. In the distance, children's laughter echoed through the valley. Somewhere, perhaps across the ocean, Rose Carter might have smiled too, knowing their story had outlived the war.